The black community in America, like many others, has a culture comprised of strong in-group preference. Despite things like a disproportionately high rate of black-on-black crime, there still exists a near universal mutual respect shared by black people for being black, even if it's not expressed explicitly. Because of that, racial betrayal is one of the most emotionally charged offenses within the black community. And titles for this offense range from Uncle Tom to Sambo to House Nigga and most commonly, Coon. Now, I know a lot of right-wing conservative-leaning blacks will argue that coon is just a term used to silence blacks for wrongthink. Others will probably argue that it's just another cancerous form of identity politics. And sometimes that is true, but not always. And while some people, black and non-black alike, may not recognize the concept of coon to be legitimate, in the black community, it is an established cultural axiom. In this video, I wanted to take a shot at explaining, from the perspective of a black person, what exactly makes someone guilty of being a coon. Let's get started.
Power to the people, power to the problem child, empowering the equal. Peeping Toms like Uncle Tom is peeping, peering through the people. Crimination, nation, natives, niggas hanging from the needle or the thread. The black is very when the stranger's fruit is evil, but the apple doesn't seem to fall too far up off this easel. Easy fall into the cellar, chatting politics and peaceful. Ain't no peace and peace is fine when it's aiming at your regal. Now the fruit is evil.
First, let's define our terms. Now, there's a lot of different definitions for the word coon. According to Urban Dictionary, a coon is a black actor or actress who takes roles that stereotypically portrays black people, which I'm not sure is accurate because I find examples like character James Carter from Rush Hour, who is the stereotypical black American sidekick, to be fucking hilarious. Or the boys of Summer from The Wire, who play the role of stereotypical young black American men selling drugs. I love all these characters, and to my knowledge, they're all equally beloved by a majority of black demographics too. So I'm not sure if it's only cooning when it's a stereotype that black people don't like or, whatever. Another definition according to Webster is an insulting or contemptuous term for a black person. Again, while vaguely true, these definitions aren't really what I'm talking about. So since I couldn't find a definition that matches the context of which I'll be referring to the term throughout this video, I went ahead and wrote my own. In my opinion, I think a sufficient definition of the word coon, as it's most commonly used by black people, would be this. A black person displaying favoritism to non-black people, usually white, whilst collectively condemning their own race for not being more culturally identical to the race they favor. The reason I chose this definition is because the nature of cooning isn't how many describe it. It's not merely acting white, nor is it merely black-on-black criticism. Rather, cooning is a sociological action, one that requires a conscious intent to subvert or defame black identity. We'll get into some examples of what I would say are reasonable perceived cases of cooning in just a bit, but first, let's talk about what cooning is not. Oftentimes, people misattribute cooning to mean anything another black person does that they themselves don't like. And when people unreasonably use language, it makes the meaning of the term pretty useless, and the term coon has been hella abused in this respect. For example, a black person having a romantic relationship with someone of another race is not inherently cooning. Is it possible that they're doing so because they have insecurities about their own race, culture, etc., and want to distance themselves from their blackness? Sure. It's also possible that they have no issue with being black and the person accusing them of cooning are themselves insecure and are projecting their emotions onto an innocent relationship. It's much more likely that you're just salty and bitter because they didn't choose you, but I ain't trying to hurt nobody's feelings. Another example of unreasonable use of the word coon is the classic, "you talk white." If you're so stupid as to think that the adoption of proper English means that someone is pandering to whites, bruh. Being literate is not in opposition to black people or black culture. Other examples include claims that, wearing your jeans waist high makes you a coon, straightening or coloring your hair makes you a coon, not voting for Obama or Democrats makes you a coon. I could go on and on with how stupid some of this shit can be. And I've learned from experience that trying to reason with stupid people is more than often a waste of time, so we're gonna leave it at that. While these are some of the dumbest examples of coon accusations, they still fall under the definition outlined earlier, that being a perception of disloyalty to the black collective. But now let's talk about some other examples of cooning, which even I, as a pretty solid individualist, can understand being classified as such. Cooning, from my experience, seems to manifest itself in one of two forms, those being passive and aggressive. Passive cooning is probably the most common. A good example of this phenomena would be CNN host Don Lemon. Now, Don is someone who I'll criticize for a number of things. His mainstream leftist propaganda, his incessant whining about racism, or his hilariously mediocre career as a journalist.
I would love to spend more time with you. You are an incredible guy. Thank you so much.
Well, what the hell did you put me on the show for?
Well, I put you on the show to get you on to talk about your series. We talked for a long time, actually.
Oh, no, but we talked for a long time off the camera.
The new show, Mike Tyson Mysteries, airs every Monday
Don
night
Lemon
at 10:30 p.m. on Adult Swim. Thank you, Mike Tyson.
Love, bro.
I love you too.
But none of those things make him a coon. Instead, Don Lemon's cooning stems from his appeals to improve the black community by whitewashing the culture. You see, Don Lemon is as mainstream blacks come. He's made a career out of assimilating into the milieu of white elites. And he's fared quite well as a result. Not only Lemon, but plenty of other black personalities. Charles Barkley, Ben Carson, Stacey Dash, Raven Simone, etc. The one thing all these guys have in common is an express favor of Eurocentric or mainstream American culture over black American culture. But I call it passive cooning because the favor of white culture expressed by these individuals is, well, passive. And it isn't followed up with an explicit disparagement of black people or black culture, which is usually a tactic of aggressive cooning. Unlike passive cooning, aggressive cooning is an act where a black person consciously divorces themselves from black culture. Again, in conjunction with the typical adoption of white American culture. A prime example of what could be perceived as aggressive cooning would be Tree of Logic. Let me preface this by making clear that this isn't me taking shots and calling Tree a coon. You know, to my knowledge, we were cool until I randomly discovered she blocked me on Twitter. But that's besides the point. I'm only using Tree as a strategic illustration. You know, it's not personal. So first, let me explain a little bit of background. Tree of Logic is a YouTuber whose channel somewhat overlaps with mine in that we're both black right-wing YouTubers, which is basically a niche category because there's so few of us. Anyway, myself and Tree both at one point had some pretty vocal alliances with the alt-right. As of late, I noticed we've both slowly begun to separate ourselves from the movement. Now, I did so gradually in favor more so of promoting black capitalism and free association type stuff. Tree, however, seemed to do so at the blink of an eye after she got BTFO'd by Mike Enoch on the JQ. She decided to chimp out and retreat back to normie conservatism. Where I might add, she's now hyperactively shilling for Israel and non-racist white conservatives, which is, you know, it's whatever, you do you sis. Now that's the background. Here's how I believe she could be interpreted as a coon for this behavior. Tree of Logic has openly said that she allied with the alt-right only because she wanted to defend white people from the anti-white left.
I have been a YouTuber for 1.5 years now, and during that time I have made 11 anti-Black Lives Matter videos and 4 self-defense instructional videos encouraging and pleading with white people to protect themselves and defend themselves against anti-white individuals. I have always been forthcoming about my quest to help keep white people the majority here in America, and I have viciously fought against anti-white hatred.
Now, this is quite different from my reasons, which were voluntary separatism and decentralization of culture, but that's fine. You know, she saw white people as a group being bullied and wanted to defend them. Now she's doing so with the Jews, you know? Okay, some could construe that as cooning, but there's really not enough evidence to accuse her of it, unless you're one of those black people who think that, you know, any black person who's friendly towards white people is a coon. Or I could even be charitable and say that Tree's rush to white knight for white people and Jews is more so due to her conservatism than anything. After all, I've also observed her to be dismissive of virtually any criticism towards police or Trump in what comes across as a dogmatic loyalty to Blue Lives Matter and a boomer tier MAGA fetish. It's possible she could just be dogmatically defending white people and Jews because of her politics, not her aversion to blacks. However, that's not all she believes. Tree of Logic also happens to hold heavy contempt towards the black community, not even necessarily certain elements within it, but the group as a whole. You see, she doesn't seek to disassociate with the entire white community just because she doesn't like the alt-right side of it. But as shown in this tweet, she's eager to disassociate from the black community as a whole, presumably due to her disdain for groups like Black Lives Matter. So, if that's true, then I could see why one would come to the conclusion that she's a coon, because she is displaying favoritism to non-black people whilst collectively condemning her own race for not being more culturally similar to the race she prefers. Aggressive cooning is by far an extreme rarity, not only because of the huge amounts of energy I suspect must go into impassioned counter-signaling of the collective, but more so its social consequences in terms of a personal relationship to the culture. And this brings me to the final point I wanted to touch on, and that's the consequential result of being accused of being a coon. Most Black Americans are natively settled in communities that have a distinctive blackness to them. Now, this can be defined in a number of ways, such as the food, the music, the behavioral norms, the language, etc. In essence, blackness is just a synonym for common culture. To be black genetically is not necessarily translative to being black culturally, or being accepted as part of the cultural in-group. I want to make sure this is understood because it's something that seems to be lost on many non-black people who object to the term coon. There's a real-world relevance behind the meme of who gets invited to the cookout. Being of African descent doesn't necessarily mean you're entitled to a plate. In fact, a non-black person who is unequivocally removed from black culture is far more likely to be welcomed by the community than a black person who's a cultural outcast. But I think it is important to add that sometimes people who are black but don't, really reflect black culture are incorrectly categorized as coons. And this is, for lack of better terms, problematic. Probably the most well-known synonym for coon is Uncle Tom. Now, the term Uncle Tom originated from the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, where in the original writing, he actually accepted being brutally beaten to death by his slave master because he refused to aggress against his fellow slaves or assist in their capture in order to do so. However, after the various film adaptations in the 1930s, the term Uncle Tom was repopularized to mean a slave who showed unconditional loyalty and servitude to the master. Stereotypically, an Uncle Tom would serve as the master's right-hand nigger, receiving special privileges, authority over other slaves, and increased compassion from the master, relative to the treatment of other slaves, that is. But another party who also received similar privileges and compassion were the house slaves. Now, a house slave could sometimes be an Uncle Tom, but it wasn't an absolute. Oftentimes, house slaves were chosen not merely because of their obedience to the plantation's hierarchy, but their fair skin, their attractiveness, and even secretive relation to the master. It wasn't terribly uncommon for the unclaimed children conceived between the whites and the slaves to be granted refuge from field work because of their familiar relation. Now, I know some of you are wondering why I went on this totally random tangent, but this is another important point that I failed to mention earlier in understanding what a coon, by modern standards, is not. Oftentimes, people will call other blacks who are simply raised outside of black culture a coon. I actually recall back in middle school, we had a student join who had just moved from London. Let's call him D. Anyway, he was picked on pretty regularly. Regrettably, I was guilty of this as well. But he was teased and joned because he had a strong African British accent. He was pretty feminine, either gay or metrosexual, and he didn't really act black, as most of the students knew it. Now, my school was 99% black, consistently, from elementary through high school, East Metro Atlanta. And as a result, the school was culturally homogenous. So when D came, many people accused him of being a coon because you could tell he had a distinct European fashion sense, he had European vernacular and mannerisms, etc. But I think it's important to distinguish between a black person who favors white culture and projects that favoritism onto black communities, such as Don Lemon, from a black person who simply reflects the culture of which they were raised in, like D. A house slave who was merely raised around whites and has had white culture impressed upon them isn't the same as an Uncle Tom who consciously rejects and works to displace blackness. By the way, I'm not saying that black people who are raised in white dominant cultures are house slaves, it's just a metaphor. The reason I wanted to bring this up is because I want people to know that being labeled a coon isn't always a mundane thing. For people like me, it's whatever, because I don't really value external opinions nearly as much as most people. Besides, most of the weirdos who call me coon are, internet niggas talking shit over Twitter. Most of the time, white liberals. Guaranteed, if any of them tried to accuse me of that shit within my Atlanta social circles, they'd be laughed out of the room. But for others, it can have some pretty impactful social ramifications. It's similar to being labeled a snitch in that regard, It can dissolve social trust, evict you from established relationships, and in some extreme cases, even put your safety at risk. Kind of like the effect of being labeled a Nazi or a white supremacist. While there are some legit Nazis out there, oftentimes the term is just a loaded smear campaign intended to silence or harm ideological opponents. And a lot of people, unfortunately, use coon in the same way. While, in my opinion, the term does have a legitimate role in being used, it's much more common for it to just be weaponized by malicious people who don't like what you say or how you act. Anyway, guys, that's going to do it for this video. There's no real solution to the malicious use of the word coon, but I think if more people, really understand what the term means and, better understand how to use the language, it could be mitigated. And that's what I hope this video can serve as. In the Black community, we have a unique language that, for the most part, is commonly understood. I think I've even seen it referred to as AV, African American Vernacular English, or Black English, whatever you want to call it. It's cultural communication, and I think it's important for us to better solidify the meaning and intended usage of these terms. Eventually, the repeated real-world usage of the term will establish a sort of pseudo consensus. I just want to make this video anyway, adding my own take explaining how I believe Black people should define the term. Let me know you guys' thoughts on this video in the comment section, and if you like it, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps me out in analytics. And if you want, consider supporting the channel for as little as $1 per month on Maker Support. It's a small contribution, but it goes a really long way to keep videos like this coming to you, and I really am truly grateful to everybody who's made a contribution or a donation. You guys are awesome as fuck, and thanks for watching.